Good morning, church. I want to invite you to join us as we read from the book of 2 Corinthians this morning. Today we'll be reading 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 11 through 21. I'll read the passage and then finish by saying, "This is the word of the Lord." And you can respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." I have been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you. For I was not at all inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me this wrong. Here for the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? But granting that I myself did not burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act in the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. This is the word of the Lord.
One more thing which we forgot to mention, which is one of our staff members, Mikey Johnson, is preaching over in San Jose this morning at Oak Grove Baptist Church. So super thankful for him, and our prayers are with him, of course. I have a huge privilege to serve with amazing people at this church, and it's pretty cool that as a church that's not even 7 years old, we're able to send out young men who are being trained up to go and preach at different churches. So very, very thankful for that. Oak Grove is one of our churches within our association, and a faithful older church. So, well, I want to dive into this passage this morning, and really, I think one of the key themes in this passage is the idea that when you open yourself up to relationships, you open yourself up to hurt. But you also open yourself up to incredible joy. This is sort of a paradox of relationship. I heard someone say a long time ago that before you have kids, your happiness is on a scale of 1 to 10. And once you have kids, your happiness goes up to 100 and down to negative 100. And I think that's pretty accurate, actually, that there's a much wider range because now you're so invested in these little lives. But I don't think that that's just true in having kids. I think that's actually true of us in the life of the church. That as we grow together and invest in each other and give ourselves to each other in different ways, that you actually increase your own capacity for blessing, and you also increase your own capacity for hurt, for tragedy. This is what happens when you truly care for other people. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Four Loves, he very famously speaks about how relationships they make you vulnerable. He says this, he's speaking in the book about the idea of how do you keep your heart safe in loving other people. And he comes to this conclusion. He says, there is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your own selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. That's a very strong statement. But he's saying to love is to be vulnerable. To be in community is to be vulnerable. And this really gets to the heart of really what we're about as a church. We call ourselves Gospel Community Church, and we need to remember that's not just that we're here to proclaim the truth of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, but we're also here to be a community together, to live with each other, and to demonstrate the gospel that we preach by our lives and our love toward each other. And I realize sometimes it would have been easier to pick a name other than Gospel Community Church, right? We could have picked like the gospel, watch the service, and then leave church, or sit on the couch and, not be in relationship church. Community is a challenging thing. And more people in our world are getting away from community, away from relationships as soon as they get challenging. But I want to encourage you this morning to take steps today to expand your relational capacity, to enter into the community. I want to invite you to expand your joy in God by expanding your joy in others, but also to open yourself up to the possibility that there could be hurt in that. So we're in this book of 2 Corinthians, and we're coming to the very end, right? Next week we'll finish this book that we've been in for a long time, and the Apostle Paul, who wrote this letter to the church in Corinth, he's been progressively pulling back the curtain of his relationship with this church in this Greek city of Corinth. And you can see here he's dealing with a fractured relationship with these people that he loves. But he clearly believes the community is worth fighting for. He wants to have a good relationship with them. And so he's dealing with some of these issues. We said early in our study of this book that this book of 2 Corinthians is one of the most autobiographical of all Paul's letters. He really gets into his own feelings and his own experience in relationship with them. We see a lot of his character. And so we've studied this book, and we've been able to learn from the great apostles' example, and we've seen this clear thread traced throughout that's been building and kind of came to a crescendo or climax last week, which is that Paul's weakness isn't his downfall, it's his strength. The Apostle Paul's not afraid to say, I am weak, and I'm weak in all these ways, and yet it's through that weakness that Jesus Christ displays his power in my life. If you remember last week, we saw that Paul had this thorn in the flesh that was tormenting him. And we said we can't really say definitively what that thorn in the flesh is. Everyone speculates. No one really knows. But we do know that whatever was causing the suffering was brought by God into his life in order to change his perspective. There was a divine purpose in this thorn in the flesh to make Paul fully dependent, not on himself, but on God. So God gave this hardship to him. And so he can say, as he's been learning to live with this thorn in the flesh, he can say, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And I hope that you can say the same thing. Because when we accept our humanity, our weakness, our frailty, then we're able to understand that we never should have depended on ourselves to begin with. It was always God that had to work through us to make anything of us. And that's where this passage picks up. Paul's not just sharing his story for sympathy, he's showing us what real gospel-rooted love looks like. So we're going to see a lot about this love. It's a love that tells the truth even when it's hard. It's a love that keeps coming back even when rejected. And it's a love that calls people back to Christ no matter what the cost. So let's examine this love this morning. First, we see that love rejoices in the truth even when it's challenging. Love rejoices in the truth even when it's challenging. True love is honest, but more than that, it rejoices in the truth, as 1 Corinthians 13 says. That this truthfulness starts with being honest about yourself. Look at how Paul starts this section off by speaking of himself. It's very interesting. He says in verse 11, I have been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you, for I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. So Paul's start here, he's saying, you forced me to behave this way. Now, in context, again, he's been saying, it's foolish to brag about yourself in any way. Even though he's bragging about how God has brought him low and made him weak, he still acknowledges this is a really silly way to engage with other people. But he kind of has to because he's been maligned by this group of these so-called super apostles. And so he has to kind of defend himself. He's been forced to it. But he says here that he says, I am nothing. I'm not inferior to these guys, but I'm still nothing. What does he mean by that? Really, I think we have to ask the question, what is humility? What is humility? Is humility simply just talking down about yourself all the time? I'm the worst. I'm not smart. I'm so weak. Is this the posture that God calls us to be humble? Well, no, I don't think that's the case. Humility is really just being honest with yourself about yourself. It's having an accurate view of yourself and then not trying to puff yourself up to other people. In other words, a humble person doesn't lie to make themselves sound more humble. If you met a PhD in mathematics and they said, I'm no better at math than you are, you'd say, okay, then you just wasted a decade of your life getting this PhD. I don't trust you for anything. No, that'd be silly. It'd be silly for a pro athlete to act like they're not good at their sport compared to an average person. That would be silly. No, that's not being honest with yourself. Humility has to come with an honest self-assessment. It's seeing yourself in the light and especially facing the faults that you have and not being afraid to own them. So we have to stop with the view that we have to lie about ourselves. We shouldn't brag about ourselves. That's not good. We also should not lie about ourselves. We need to be honest. So Paul here, he says he's nothing. How can he say that? Is that self-deprecating? Is he self-loathing here? No, I think Paul is simply just seeing himself in light of who God is. He has a God-centered perspective, so when he looks at himself, not in terms of his value as a human being, but in terms of his accomplishment as a servant of God, he says, I'm nothing. I've never accomplished anything on my own. I haven't done anything that's outside of what God has done through me. In that regard, I'm nothing. It's like what Jesus said in Luke 17 when he was speaking about how, a servant shouldn't expect to be waited upon by their master. A servant doesn't go out and do its work and then come inside and say, okay, now I'm ready to be served by my master. And Jesus says, in the same way, even when you've done everything you've been commanded, you should say, I'm an unworthy servant. I've only done what's required of me. Even if you did everything perfectly, which I'm going to take a guess that you haven't, right? Neither have I. But even if you did everything perfectly, you would only have done the bare minimum requirements of what it means to be a servant of God. So you're nothing. You're small, right? You can't brag about anything. In Galatians 6:3, Paul says, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. If we get puffed up because we've accomplished so many things, we're missing entirely that everything we have is from God. So to love others, we have to be honest about ourselves and assess ourselves in light of who God says that we are. Jesus encourages this often, but in Matthew 7, this is one of the times that he encourages this self-assessment. He says that when you go to confront somebody about their sin, that you first, instead of taking the speck out of their eye, should take the log out of your own. He's not saying you shouldn't help your friend who's in sin or who has error, but you should first examine yourself and be honest with yourself, and then go and help those around you. Before you can be honest with others, you really have to be honest with yourself. So the Apostle Paul, he's saying here, I'm nothing. In light of who God is, I can't brag about anything. But there's also sort of a backhanded critique of these so-called super apostles that have been opposing Paul, right? Because he says, I'm not less than these guys, even though I'm nothing. So what's he saying about these guys? Well, they're less than nothing. They shouldn't be bragging about themselves. We've seen some of the bad things that they've been doing in the previous passages. So Paul's honest about himself, but his honesty doesn't just cut in one direction. He's not just saying, I'm nothing, I'm the worst of the worst. He also then acknowledges in the following verse who he is and what God's done through him. Look at verse 12. He says, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience and with signs and wonders and mighty works. So Paul knows that he's an apostle, and when needed, he uses that title. He calls himself sometimes a servant of Christ, but he's not afraid to also say the truth, which is he has been called by God for a very special role in this transitional period of the church being formed. And he's authenticated that among them. When he was with them, he did signs and wonders and mighty works. These three words are all basically synonyms for the same thing, right? He's saying, I did these miraculous things among you as signs. A sign exists to point to something else. So the point is not the miracle itself. God didn't teach us to just come and to look for these miracles in and of themselves, but to know what they point to, which is God and the coming of his kingdom. So Paul did these miracles in their midst, and we see some of them in the book of Acts. He did these miracles to show them the truth of the gospel that he was preaching, and to show them that he was in this special class of apostle. Now, should we expect these miracles to be done today? I think yes and no. God is a God of miracles. He does miracles all the time. Again, Ben talked about that a couple weeks ago, that we can pray in faith knowing that God can heal, he can do miracles, and he still does miracles. But in terms of a class of person that could do miracles sort of on command, as we see the apostles doing, they could just say, boom, you're healed. We don't have that today. I think it's safe to say. But we don't have apostles, those who have seen the risen Christ and have been with him in his ministry. We don't have those kinds of people. We're in a different era today. So again, we should still pray for them. We should still expect God can do them. But we have something very different in the way of how that works today. But the point here is that Paul's aware of his role, and he's aware of the power that God has given to him. He doesn't back down from this conflict, even though he's very humble in the midst of it. He has an accurate view of himself, and he knows how God works through him. I think our takeaway from this should be there's a balance between humility and confidence. I think we often think the person who's humble is not confident in themselves, or the person who is confident and strong cannot be humble. That wasn't true of Christ. It wasn't true of the Apostle Paul. No, actually, humility and rock-solid confidence fit sort of hand in glove. Humility comes from seeing ourselves in light of who God is and realizing that we are nothing, but confidence comes when we acknowledge that we aren't working by ourselves. God's power is working through us. Paul didn't say, I'm nothing and therefore I'm going to do nothing. I'm just going to sit here and sit in the fetal position. No, he said, I'm nothing, but God is working his power through me. Therefore, I can do anything that God calls me to do. Humility and confidence. In 2 Corinthians 3, earlier in the same book here, in 3:5, Paul says this, not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us. That's humility, right? Nothing is coming from us. We're not sufficient in ourselves. But, he goes on, our sufficiency is from God. That's confidence. We are sufficient for the task that we've been called to because God is empowering us for that task. So if you keep thinking to yourself, I can't accomplish anything, I'm too weak, then you're focusing too exclusively on yourself. Your focus is misplaced, and that's the essence of pride. That's not humility, because it's still all about you. But if you're looking to God, then that's when you can learn true humility and true power and begin to live in faith that God can work through someone as small and insignificant as you. You know, this is usually the big problem when a young guy gets up to preach. You know, we have a lot of guys who are learning and growing, and they're awesome. But often the first time somebody preaches, they want to honor God, but they also want to look good while doing it. Right? I mean, I've been there. I still struggle with that, of course. And so you have to learn to get out of the way so that God can be lifted up. I remember when I was brand new in preaching, especially when I preached in front of the big church, right? Quote unquote big church. Because it's like all these older people. Laura would lovingly tell me, you know, Laura's the most encouraging person in the world. Like amazing. But she would very gently just say, you did a great job, but you got to stop playing with your hair, okay? It looks fine. And, I'd be like, oh man, that's really embarrassing, right? So I'm like, I don't want the thing sticking up in the back. And I'm just thinking about myself the whole time. You have to acknowledge that, and you have to fight against it because it's so difficult, because you can't point people to God while you're focused on yourself. It doesn't work. It doesn't happen. You have to be okay with focusing on God and lifting him up, even if that means you're not looking your very best. We're all learning this, right? I know I'm trying to. Love starts with honesty about yourself. If you don't see yourself accurately, it's very hard to love others. But true love also consists of honesty with others. It does. It has to lead to that. Paul's addressing here this key criticism about him, that he didn't accept money from the Corinthian church. If If you've been with us, you've heard this, right? This has been a key thread throughout the book. Remember, the culture in Rome, in the Roman culture, it was a patron culture, so giving gifts was really important as to how society functioned, and there were those who were benefactors and those who were on the receiving end of that, and there was an expectation if you were receiving gift that you would return something to the one giving. That's kind of how it worked. And if someone wouldn't accept a gift, that could really be insulting. So, but Paul, he's not receiving the money. Why? We don't really know, but it's likely he was concerned about the control that would be exerted over him if he took that gift. That's very likely. It's a young church. They're immature. They've shown a lot of immaturity in the 2 books we read about them. And so Paul's likely concerned this influential group will want to have control over him. Verse 13, he says, "For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me this wrong." You can hear the sarcasm here that Paul's speaking with, right? He's pointing out how foolish it is that they're upset with him because he didn't burden them by taking money from them. Okay, so that's what he's trying to point out. And really what's happened here is they've become cynical toward the Apostle Paul, right? Cynicism is when really everything somebody does is colored through a negative lens because you're assuming the very worst of them. Once you get cynical about somebody, it's very hard to change that. It's a very, very sad thing. William George Jordan said, "A cynic is a man who is morally nearsighted and brags about it. He sees evil in his own heart and thinks he sees the world." In other words, that the cynical person, everything looks dark because they're looking through the lens of their own dark heart. They see bad motives where none exist. In psychology, we call this projection, right? They project their own evil motives or actions onto others, and this is likely what's happening here. Paul won't do what they want, and they're insulted by it, and they assume the worst about the Apostle Paul, even though he hasn't done anything wrong. Paul's been undermined because of these really silly accusations. And if you think that in our world today, a positive action, doing something sacrificial for somebody, can't be interpreted in the worst possible light, then this is not a cultural thing. This is just the human heart. We all are capable of doing this. People will get mad over anything and everything, and they can always find some foolish and sympathetic person who will encourage them by indulging and even inflaming their anger, thinking they're doing something good. Satan knows how to get into our hearts and to turn a blessing from somebody into a curse. As Christians, we have to resist that. But true love, it speaks the truth to others. Love doesn't indulge delusion. Love doesn't shrug at deception. Love has to be willing to speak the truth that's hard to hear. And love is always speaking truth in a world that's full of lies. That's what love does. And can we take just a minute to acknowledge that this is the opposite of how our world functions, right? I'm sure we can all think of examples of we've seen this where the truth is right in front of us, and yet something untrue is being said in the name of love, of compassion, of empathy. One of the most insidious ways we've seen this in our culture is when somebody has a child who is struggling with their gender, right? I'm sure we've all heard stories on this. We've seen it in our own lives. But a child doesn't know what gender they are. They're confused. It happens all the time in our culture. A daughter who actually suddenly believes that she's a boy, and they'll go to a therapist, and the therapist will say something like this, right? It'll say that, well, this girl actually is a boy, and if you don't embrace that, you'll force them to commit suicide. And the phrase that's often used is, do you want a living son or do you want a dead daughter? The question is framed as if lying to someone is actually loving someone, and as if truth-telling is actually condemning or hating someone. It's completely untrue, right? But even as I say this, you can probably feel emotions in your own heart as to how much that issue has weighed on our culture. And of course, it's absolutely not true. Of course, we should be filled with compassion and care for people who are struggling, the families that are trying to love their children. But telling the truth is always what we're called to do. And nothing should convince us that lies are more loving than the truth. Again, 1 Corinthians 13:6 says, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with The truth. The truth is always our friend. So there are smaller and more subtle ways that we can practice this every day, right? Ask yourself, when am I tempted to avoid the truth and to actually indulge something that I know is untrue? Well, when am I tempted to be silent when I should be speaking the truth? You know, we aren't called to go out of our way in every situation to tell the truth all the time, right? We don't have to be jerks or seek people out just to insult them. That's not what I'm saying here. But we will be called every day to say things that are challenging to our spouse, to our kids, to our neighbors, our friends. We'll have to speak truth to them in ways that may risk offending them. Maybe you have a relationship where you've been backing away from that relationship because you want to avoid speaking the truth. And I think often what we do is we decide, we kind of work through in our own heads what that person is going to say when we speak truth to them, and we never give them the chance to respond. We condemn them in a sense and think that we're being kind by doing it. But it's possible that God's calling you to move toward that person in love, and before you write them off, to lovingly speak the truth to them, to love them in a way maybe nobody else is. And that leads us to the second characteristic of love in this passage, which is that love risks rejection and doesn't give up. Love risks rejection and doesn't give up. Verse 14, Paul says, "Here for the third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you." Paul is coming again, even though the last visit he had was very difficult. So he's coming to them again, knowing that this could be rough. This could be a challenging meeting. And he clarifies why he's coming. He doesn't want what they have, and he's made that clear by not receiving gifts from them at this point. He doesn't want what they have. He wants them. He wants to have a relationship with them. He wants to see them come to the knowledge of God, to come to maturity, to be fully devoted to Jesus. That's why he's there. And he understands his responsibility as well. Look at the second half of verse 14. He says, "For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children." Parents are supposed to provide resources for their kids. That's how God made it to work. And we all hope to leave something good for our children when we're gone, right? The response to that is simply to be grateful toward your parents. You can't go back and repay your parents for all they did for you in childhood. Someday, all of us come to that realization, right? Wow, my parents did way more for me than I ever knew. You can't repay it. And Paul's saying, I don't want that. Paul is standing in the position of a parent, and he's saying, you are my children. I'm trying to give and sacrifice for you. That's why I'm here. It's amazing. But they aren't being appropriately thankful to Paul for what he's done, and they aren't honoring him. They've, in a sense, really rejected him in spite of his sacrifice. Verse 15, he says, "I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls." This is amazing. I will give what I have, and I'll give myself. I'll spend, and I'll be spent for you, because I care about you. This is amazing sacrifice. John 15:13, Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends." Paul's done that, and he's saying, I'm going to keep doing it. I'm risking rejection from you and giving more to you, even as we're in this conflict. Verse 15, he goes on, he says, "If I love you more, am I to be loved less?" That's a powerful question, and I think it really points to the challenges we often have in relationship. Especially in a relationship that's a little bit uneven, where somebody is the parent and the child, or the person who's mentoring someone, the discipler and the disciple. That often in those relationships, there can be something given by one person, and yet the reception is not to love the person giving more, but actually to love them less. I don't know why. This doesn't make sense to me entirely. It's just kind of part of human nature. But very often children will be ungrateful for what a parent does. They won't understand it. And as you give more to somebody else, you're actually loved less. Now, it's not always the case, thank God. But it does point us to that loving someone, it often means risking rejection and mistreatment from them. As the more you give, you're not just giving at what you have, you're opening your heart to somebody else. And the rejection that comes from that can be so difficult. Verses 16 to 18, I'm going to read these here. This is kind of a big argument he's making. But verse 16, he says, "But granting that I myself did not burden you, I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act in the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? So here you see kind of the accusation more directly. Essentially what it seems like was being said was, well, Paul's not taking the gifts from us directly because he's trying to raise funds for the churches, but maybe Paul's dealing dishonestly with the money that's leaving the church for the other church, the Jerusalem church. And maybe Paul is skimming some off the top for himself. That seems to be what's being said here, which of course is crazy, right? It seems so crazy. He wouldn't receive money from them because he wanted to steal money from them. That doesn't make any sense, but he's appealing to them. He's saying, look, this is who we've sent. This is how we've dealt with things financially. Don't you see that this is the pattern we've walked in? What else could we do, right? So Paul here, he's not just trying to defend himself. He cares about the truth. He cares about what's being said about his ministry and of his fellow workers, and the lies that are being told to undermine the work he's trying to do. It's so silly that Paul has to answer these accusations, but he realizes that by going to them, he's going to open himself up possibly to new accusations. There's a risk in loving people like this. What about you? Are you afraid of taking a risk in your relationships? Are you playing it safe? And at the same time, you're not loving those around you? It can be difficult. It can be difficult because often for us, we've experienced pain in relationship, right? I'm sure if you've been around for a while, you have. But you have to still take risks and risk someone rejecting you. I thought of a good example of this. I was reading this book the last couple of weeks called The Fuel and the Flame. I know a lot of the challenge students have read it. It's written by Steve Shadrach and Paul Wooster. Paul Wooster is actually someone that most of you don't know, but we should be very thankful for as a church because he trained up Cody and Brittany and the team for Challenge and then sent them out here to start Challenge at UCSC. So he's personally a guy that we're very indebted to. But this book that he wrote, it's about kind of how do college students reach their campus and live for God. It's an amazing book. But he has this one part where he's talking through the book a lot about sharing the good news with people. It's stuff that we could all benefit from reading. And he says, this is our calling as Christians to bring eternal life to others by sharing what Jesus has done for us, that we can give eternal hope to people. And then they make a challenge in the book they challenge with the idea of asking the golden question. And I love this idea because essentially what they said is often we will kind of share things in a guarded way, but we won't ever take a risk with what we share. And one of the ways they encourage us to take a risk as Christians, as we're sharing the good news with people, is to ask this golden question, which is really just to directly ask someone, do you want to believe in Jesus? Do you want to put your faith in Jesus for salvation? And to ask it and to actually give time to allow a response. That's a scary thing to ask because the person might say, what? No, I don't want that, right? But in taking that risk, it's a powerful thing that most people go their whole life and no one ever asks them, do you want to believe in Jesus? And so one of the best ways that we could take risks in relationship is by sharing the good news with people and by asking them, do you want to believe and to receive life? You'll be amazed at how many people respond and say, yes, I do want that. Who in your life needs to hear the good news and to hear that golden question? This week we need to all be praying about those who are far from God and ask God that God would give us a burden for those people, that we would be burdened to know that people are living their life and heading toward hell, away from God. And we need to pray that God would give us the faith to step out, to take a risk, to share the good news with them. Not because we want approval from others, but because Jesus Christ gave everything for us. So we need to risk everything for others. So we've seen that love rejoices in truth even when it's challenging, and that love risks rejection and never gives up. Third, we see love seeks repentance even through tears. Love seeks repentance even through tears. For the sake of time, we're going to go to verse 20 here. We don't have much time left. Verse 20, he says, "For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. That perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder." Paul knows that they want Paul to be someone different. They want him to be this outwardly impressive sort of guy. And he's not that. So he's saying, you're going to maybe be disappointed by who I am. But he says, I'm also afraid that I'm going to be disappointed by who you are. And what he's speaking of here is their spiritual state. He's afraid that they will still be stuck in sin. And the sins that he lists here, they're these sort of relational toxins that infect and destroy. Imagine that you go and you look at a home and you want to rent it or purchase it, and the outside looks beautiful. It's perfect, right? The yard is perfect. There's paint, and it looks so pristine. But you go inside and you smell this horrible smell. As you begin to look deeper into the house, you realize there's toxic mold everywhere. There's water damage. There's insects. There's all kinds of things wrong with the house on the inside. This is what sin does in the life of the church, and we don't fight against it. It spreads, and it destroys, and it harms in ways that we can't see at first, but which always become obvious eventually. So Paul, he's nervous here that he's going to come, he's going to find that they haven't dealt with the things deep inside of their hearts. Verse 21, he says, I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. So Paul's fearful. He's fearful that they may not have turned away from these sin patterns that were in their culture and that defined them, many of them. Have they truly repented? And so Paul loves them, but in loving them, he's always looking at the big things. Have they sufficiently turned from these patterns of sin? It's the job of those who are strong to help those who are weak and who are failing in sin. Galatians 6:1 says, brothers, if anyone's caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If we see a person in our church who's caught in sin, our heart should be to help them in that. To speak truth to them, to take a risk with them in order to bring them back to their walk with God. Most often that's not an easy thing. But this is a challenging thing. It's difficult for us to be this kind of community and to bring each other back from sin. I often hear people say that a major criteria for them picking a church is that it always makes them feel good. People want to leave church not feeling down because they have something wrong with them or because they have to work on something, but they want to feel encouraged. They want maybe a self-esteem boost. Have you ever heard that from someone? Of course, it's a totally normal thing to want, of course. But what's interesting is I've never heard someone say the same thing about a doctor. No, I've never heard anyone say, my main criteria for a doctor is that when I leave, I feel like I'm totally healthy. And in fact, when a doctor says you got this sickness, most people aren't angry at the doctor. They're thankful to the doctor. And most people, when the doctor says you need to improve your health in these ways, might not follow the advice, right? But at least we understand that's his job, right? Or her job. At the very least, you understand and you don't lash out at the doctor. Why the difference in how we treat a church versus how we treat a doctor? Because deep down we know what a doctor's job is, right? We know that while the truth might hurt, that's why we go to the doctor. Why would you go to a doctor if you didn't want to hear the truth and how you could fix the problems? The problem for many of us is that we've forgotten what the church's job is. And when I say church, I'm not speaking just of whoever's up here. I'm speaking of all of us as a community. We're not here to give each other a self-esteem boost and then go back to living the same way. We're called to look into the mirror of God's law and to respond to what we see, to experience conviction. We're meant to have the Holy Spirit lay us bare and expose the inner parts of our lives and our weaknesses and our sins. And then we bring the grace of God, and that's when we experience the healing and change. Honestly acknowledging those things and then dealing with it. This place is meant to be a hospital for sinners. And we're not just called to be cheerleaders for each other's bad decisions. We're meant to be the physicians of God. And sometimes that means surgery, and surgery hurts. There's no guarantee we'll feel immediately better about ourselves. James 5:19 and 20 says, my brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Next week, we're going to be finishing this book of 1st or 2nd Corinthians, and then we'll immediately begin a series we'll have over the summer, at least for the first part of the summer, and we'll be talking about some of the common sins that we see in our culture and even in the church that are more subtle, that are things that we often put up with, don't see as a big deal, that we can address. It really fits in with what Paul's talking about here. So I'm excited to begin that series and dig more into that. But for us this morning, right, I think what I want to conclude on is that a life that's lived in love will lead to more hurt, but it also will lead to more joy. As we reach out to that person who is struggling in sin and we help them with the truth, we bring blessing to others, we bring blessing into our own lives as well. Living this life of blessing others means taking risks, speaking truth, and yes, sometimes even receiving blowback that might come from that. And yet, to keep persisting, because God and others are worth it. And the ultimate example of this, of course, is Jesus Christ himself. Jesus lived fully in the truth. In fact, he is the truth. He didn't just call people to repentance, he made a way by his own sacrifice that we could truly know God. He didn't just risk everything, he gave everything for us. John 1:11 says, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Rejection from people, but he's welcomed in his children. He's given life to everyone who would receive him. And we see that he did this because it gave him joy, greater hurt, greater pain, yes, of course. But ultimately greater joy to be in relationship with us and to call us to be in relationship with each other. So how will you respond to this truth this morning? Will you embrace community even when it's difficult? And maybe your past experience have taught you to be cynical. Will you speak truth that hurts and heals? Will you step further into the same risk-taking, joy-expanding love for others that Christ himself demonstrated? Will you trust him and follow his example? Let's pray together and ask for God's strength as we do this.